Welcome to the book's Random Stories.
Ah,
Our very first episode. I'm so excited to start this journey with all of you, exploring some really cool short stories and seeing how they connect to our lives.
I think it's going to be fascinating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for our very first episode, we have a story called The Demon in My Dreams. It kind of touches on some pretty universal themes. Confronting those struggles we have on the inside, managing stress and self-doubt, and ultimately finding freedom by just accepting things.
You know, it's interesting when you think about how we kind of frame these internal challenges as if they were something outside of us.
Oh,
You know, we call them a demon or whatever. It's like we try to come up with a name and a form so we can push it away from ourselves a little bit, those uncomfortable feelings.
Yeah, it's easier to fight something that's outside of you. You know, it's harder to admit that those feelings are actually part of you.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's really what the story is about, that struggle to confront those feelings.
So, to really get into this, we're going to read The Demon in My Dreams out loud. We'll switch off to make it more interesting.
Okay.
Then we can dive into some deeper discussion, see what you all think. Ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Here we go. It started like any other night. The moonlight spilling through the cracked blinds of my bedroom window, casting jagged shadows on the walls. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound, a reminder that time never stopped. That was when it happened, when the dreams began.
I can still remember the first night I saw it. The demon. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. Its form was shifting, as though it couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. But one thing was clear. It was terrifying. Its presence was overwhelming, like it filled the entire room. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move. My chest tightened, as if a weight was pressing down on me, suffocating me.
It didn't speak, not at first. It just watched, its eyes glowing with a darkness deeper than anything I'd ever seen. And every time I tried to scream, to wake up, the room would close in around me even tighter, like it was holding me captive. Eventually, the dream would fade, and I would wake up, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. But it was always there, lurking in the edges of my consciousness, waiting for the next night.
As the days passed, the dreams became more frequent. It was always the same. The demon would appear in the darkness, watching me, waiting. And every time it did, it felt like a new battle. But soon, I realized it wasn't just a dream anymore.
The demon wasn't just in my sleep. It had begun to creep into my waking life, too. It took the shape of the stress from work, the piles of paperwork, the looming deadlines that never seemed to end.
It was the overwhelming feeling of inadequacy when I couldn't meet the expectations of others. It was the fear that I would never be good enough, that I would always be trapped in a cycle of disappointment.
The demon was wearing the mask of my own doubts, feeding on my insecurities and growing stronger each day.
I tried to ignore it at first. I pushed through the days, telling myself that if I just kept going, the demon would eventually fade away. But it didn't. It only grew louder, more insistent. It started to haunt my thoughts during the day, whispering doubts, planting seeds of fear, convincing me that I was weak, that I wasn't capable of facing the challenges ahead.
One day, I reached my breaking point. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, but nothing made sense. The work was piling up, the emails were flooding in, and I felt like I was drowning. The pressure of it all was unbearable, like an invisible hand tightening around my throat. That's when I heard it, the familiar, haunting voice of the demon.
You're not strong enough, it said. You'll never make it. You'll fail, just like you always do.
I felt the weight of its words settle over me like a shroud. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I was too tired, too overwhelmed. I thought about quitting, just walking away from it all, leaving the work behind, leaving everything behind. But then a thought struck me. What if the demon wasn't just something I had to run from? What if the only way to escape it was to face it head on?
And so I did. I stood up from my desk and walked out of the office, leaving everything behind for the first time in weeks. I went to the park, to the one place where I'd always felt a sense of peace. The wind rustled through the trees, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe.
I sat on a bench, closed my eyes, and allowed myself to just be. The demon was still there, lurking in the back of my mind, but for the first time I wasn't running from it. I was facing it.
You think you can defeat me? The demon whispered, its voice like cold wind on my neck.
I don't need to defeat you, I said, my voice calm. I just need to live with you. I need to stop letting you control me.
The demon laughed, a sound like broken glass. You're weak, you'll never escape me.
I didn't respond. Instead, I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs. I realized then that the demon wasn't something that could be destroyed. It was a part of me, a reflection of the fears and insecurities I had carried with me for years, and the more I tried to fight it, the more power I gave it over me.
But in that moment, I understood. The key to overcoming the demon wasn't in defeating it, it was in accepting it, acknowledging that it was there, and learning to live alongside it. It was in choosing not to let it control my every move.
Over the next few weeks, the demon came and went. It would appear in my dreams and my thoughts, but each time I faced it with a little more strength. I didn't run from it, I didn't fight it, I simply allowed it to be while I continued to live my life, to make my choices, to keep moving forward.
The more I accepted its presence, the less power it seemed to have. The weight that had once pressed down on my chest began to lift. The suffocating fear that had once ruled my life slowly dissipated. And though the demon still visited from time to time, it no longer had the ability to control me.
One night, as I lay in bed, the demon appeared again in my dreams. This time, its form was clearer, more solid. It was no longer a shifting, amorphous shape. It was a shadow of my own making, an embodiment of everything I had feared. But instead of feeling afraid, I simply watched it.
"You've learned," the demon said, its voice no longer cold, but almost resigned.
I have, I replied, and I'm not afraid of you anymore.
The demon nodded, fading away into the darkness, leaving me in peace. I woke up the next morning, not with a sense of relief, but with a quiet understanding. The demon was always going to be there, lurking in the corners of my mind. But now I knew how to live with it. I knew that I didn't have to fight it. I just had to keep living my life step by step, day by day.
And in that quiet acceptance, I had found my freedom.
Wow, that ending.
Right.
So powerful.
Yeah, it really is. The demon doesn't disappear completely, but like the protagonist's relationship with it changes completely.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful illustration of how just by accepting things, you can find that inner peace and freedom.
Right. It's not about pretending those challenging parts of ourselves aren't there, but it's more about learning to live with them and not let them control our lives.
So what about you all out there listening? What stood out to you? What parts really hit home?
That ending really stayed with me. You know, it's not that the demon is gone, it's that the protagonist isn't scared of it anymore.
Exactly. It could still be there, but it doesn't have the same power over them anymore. They've learned to accept that it's part of them without letting it rule their life.
Yeah.
What about you listening? Have you ever had an experience like that, where you learn to live with something you used to be afraid of?
It's like, you don't always have to win the small battles to win the big one.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's not about getting rid of every negative thought, right? It's about changing how we feel about them. What really got me was that the demon represents all those struggles we all have. Stress, self-doubt, trying to be perfect. That's just being human, right?
And that's what makes the story so relatable. It's like a reminder that we're all going through similar things. We're not alone.
Right. It made me think about how we're always told to think positive. Like that's the answer to everything.
Oh, yeah.
But it's not that simple, is it?
Definitely not. Forcing yourself to be positive all the time can backfire.
Totally.
It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It's going to pop up eventually.
That's such a good way to put it. We need to accept all of our emotions, even the bad ones.
What's interesting is how the protagonist finally breaks through when they stop fighting the demon and just face it.
Yeah. And they do that by actually leaving work, the source of their stress, and going to the park. It's like they needed some space to breathe and just be themselves. Have you ever felt that? Like you need to physically step away from a situation to clear your head.
That's such a good point. It's a reminder that taking care of yourself is so important.
It's not selfish.
Yeah, it's about making time to rest and deal with your emotions.
It makes me think about how we often push ourselves too hard. Even when we're exhausted, we should be nicer to ourselves, don't you think?
Totally. The story reminds us to have compassion for ourselves. Instead of beating ourselves up for having these demons, we should treat ourselves with kindness, like we treat a friend.
The protagonist's story shows that real growth isn't always about achieving something big. It's about those small changes we make inside and how we see ourselves in the world.
Yeah, it's about realizing that those tough emotions are part of us, but they don't control who we are. We can choose how we react to them.
So what are some practical things we can take away from this story? How can we use these lessons in our own lives?
I think the first step is just being aware. Noticing when those negative thoughts are creeping in. Paying attention to what your demons are telling you.
Like recognizing the thought patterns that drag us down.
Exactly. And once we see them, we can start to question them. Not by trying to push them away, but by acknowledging they're there and not letting them rule us.
It's about being in control of how we react.
Right. And sometimes that means setting boundaries to protect ourselves. Maybe it's limiting social media or saying no to extra commitments or doing things that make us feel good.
Speaking of social media, I think it's a breeding ground for those demons of comparison and self-doubt. It's easy to get caught up in what everyone else is doing and feel like we're not good enough.
Totally. We're always seeing the best versions of people online. It's not the whole story.
So what can we do about those feelings of inadequacy? How do you deal with that?
I think it helps to remember that everyone is struggling with something, even if they don't show it. We all have those demons, but we can choose how we deal with them.
That's such a good point. We don't have to believe that everyone else has it all figured out. We're all on our own paths.
And sometimes that path means asking for help. Whether it's talking to a therapist or a friend or joining a support group, connecting with others can remind us that we're not alone in our struggles.
That feeling of connection is so powerful. It can make you feel seen and heard and understood.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easy to feel like we're the only ones going through something tough. But when we share our stories or talk to people, we realize we're not alone. That can be so healing.
Definitely. Even just sharing the not-so-pretty parts of our experiences helps us see that it's okay to not be perfect. And that helps us feel less ashamed and alone.
That's one of the things I love about this story. It reminds us that everyone feels self-doubt and fear and insecurity. It's just part of being human.
Right. It's not about pretending those feelings don't exist. It's about learning how to handle them in a healthy way.
You know what else struck me? The idea that real freedom isn't about getting rid of our inner demons. It's about accepting them as part of who we are.
I think that's really profound. Accepting the hard parts of ourselves doesn't mean giving up or settling. It means recognizing those parts are there and choosing not to let them control our lives.
It's about taking back our power.
Yeah, and that's a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a process of learning and growing.
Thinking about the protagonist's journey, what's the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
For me, it's about self-care. Remember when the protagonist left the office and went to the park? That was a turning point. It was about putting their well-being first and giving themselves time to reflect.
It shows that sometimes we need to step away from things that drain us so we can reconnect with ourselves and see things more clearly.
And it doesn't have to be some big dramatic thing. It could be just taking a few minutes to meditate or listen to music or just be in nature.
Even little things can make a big difference.
Totally. It's about being kind to ourselves, especially when things are hard.
That brings us to another important takeaway: self-compassion. Instead of beating ourselves up for having these struggles, we can treat ourselves with the same kindness we'd offer a friend.
It's about accepting that we're all imperfect, and that's all right.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the demon in my dreams, remember, you're not alone in your struggles. We all have them, but we also have the power to overcome them.
It's a journey, not a destination. By being self-aware, accepting ourselves, practicing self-care, and having compassion, we can find peace and live a more fulfilling life.
I love that. So if we could give the protagonist one piece of advice, what would it be?
I tell them to trust the process, even when those demons come back. Remember, you faced them before and you can do it again. You have the strength and the ability to get through it.
And never be afraid to ask for help. Talking to a therapist, a friend, or joining a support group can make a huge difference.
Remember, you don't have to go through this alone.
That's so important. We hope you enjoyed exploring the demon in my dreams with us and that you learned something valuable from it.
We'd love to hear your thoughts. What parts resonated with you? What advice would you give the protagonist? Share your insights with us on social media or on our website.
Join us again next week for another deep dive into the world of short stories. Until then, happy reading, and may you find peace and freedom within yourselves.